Welcome in, everyone. Let's take a deep breath in. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench that jaw. Soften your heart. This is a space for curiosity, for honesty, and for healing. You don't have to agree with everything here. You don't have to have it all figured out. You only have to be willing to listen, to wonder, and to stay open. Let this be your invitation to explore your story, to examine what shaped you, and to make space for something new. This is not about answers. It's about deeper questions, softer hearts, and the kind of truth that liberates. I'm Christina Baker, and this is the Retreat Full Circle podcast. Season 1, Episode 9. Ooh, when buried stories rise. Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and the lies we've been sold. Today, we're stepping into a conversation that might feel tender, illuminating, and if we're being honest, a little uncomfortable. But I want to be very clear from the beginning. My intention is not to change anyone's faith, but to strengthen it, to broaden it, and to release you from old stories that have been manipulated to keep you small and fearful. Today's episode is more about offering you an expanded view, to simply open a window, one that for many of us has been painted shut for generations. Many of us not even realizing it, and we're torturing ourselves based on misinformation sold to us as fact. With all of the information that I bring forward today and really any other podcast, I invite you to do your own research. I'm sharing my path as one of billions, not as a roadmap to be followed. I lovingly encourage you to do your own research. This topic is deeply personal. It has taken me more than a decade to deconstruct and rebuild my relationship with the source, with the creator whom I have come to understand as loving, compassionate, and intimately connected to who I truly am. To get here, I had to peel back the heavy, layered, fear-soaked onion of the religion I was indoctrinated into, one that taught shame before love, obedience before curiosity, and sinfulness before worthiness. My spiritual journey has been a process of breaking free from a belief system built on fear and shame and discovering one grounded in love, everyday miracles, and profound healing, and mainly, and most importantly, authentic connection. The more I allowed my authenticity to come forward, the closer I felt to a God who actually felt like God, not the God of punishment and perfectionism, but the God who formed me, who delights in me, who meets me exactly how I am. And I am not only speaking of my sexuality, but more of the life that brings me joy in all arenas. Today, my faith, my beliefs, the way I love others and myself looks nothing like the narrow script I was handed at birth and clung to into my early adulthood. I've come to use different language when I speak about God because the words of my past no longer feel accurate or resonant. Titles like Lord or even God often carried a sense of power over me, a hierarchy I just didn't relate to. Now I speak of the creator, source, or the universe. Words that feel expansive, alive, and nurturing. This language feels like a warm embrace, a blanket of unconditional love wrapped around me by a presence whose only desire is to guide me towards becoming the best version of myself. It invites intimacy rather than fear, connection rather than obedience. It reminds me that the divine is not distant or punitive, but inherently supportive and deeply personal. Being told over and over that I was broken, sinful, and in constant need of saving, combined with the expectation of blind submission to religious authority, created a war inside my body and my mind. One that left emotional, mental, and even physical scars. Ultimately, there was a time when suicide was not off the table. And this is why today's conversation matters. Because sometimes healing begins not with an answer, but with a question we were never allowed to ask. My purpose here is to break the chains of misinformation, to give you permission to think for yourself, and for you to let go of the stories that keep you small and broken. So I want to start with a simple analogy, something that we can all understand. Imagine a person convicted of a serious crime. The evidence at that time seemed convincing. The testimony lined up, the experts agreed, and so they were sentenced, sometimes for life. But then, decades later, new evidence surfaces, DNA, old records, forgotten documents, or possibly new technology. Something utterly unavailable at the time of the original trial. And suddenly the story changes. Now, we don't cling stubbornly to the old verdict out of pride. We don't say, well, this is what we believed back then, so it must still be true. No, we reopen the case because truth deserves a fair hearing, especially when new evidence emerges. I want to offer another example of how human certainty can be completely misplaced. And I'm talking about something as concrete as medicine, real, physical, scientific medicine. For thousands of years, literally up until the 19th century, one of the most trusted, respected, unquestioned treatments in the world was bloodletting. Doctors believed that nearly any illness, fever, infection, fatigue, inflammation, even mental distress could be cured by draining blood from the body. Sometimes they use knives, sometimes they use cups, and sometimes, if you were really especially lucky, you got leeches applied to your skin to suck it out for you. And here's the wildest part. This wasn't fringe. This wasn't witchcraft. This was mainstream medical science. Presidents underwent it. Royalty underwent it. Your average person in the street underwent this type of treatment. In 1799, when George Washington developed a severe throat infection, his doctors drained 40% of his blood within hours. 40%. They genuinely believed they were saving him. Modern medicine now says they probably hastened his death. But they weren't trying to cause harm. They were doing what every expert of the time believed was right. It was the best science of the day. It was in all the textbooks. It was in the medical schools. It was passed down with confidence and authority. everyone was certain this was the truth until new information emerged. Microscopes, germ theory, better understanding of physiology, and suddenly the story changed. What was once absolute medical fact became an embarrassing chapter in history. And that's the point. Human institutions, whether medical, political, or religious, are shaped by the knowledge available at the time and by the power structures deciding which knowledge gets preserved. When new information surfaces, we don't cling to outdated beliefs out of fear. We evolve, we learn, we integrate, we correct the record. Just like we no longer drain blood to cure a cough, maybe it's time to take a fresh look at spiritual history too. When I was a kid growing up in the strict confines of the Southern Baptist Church, I was taught something without question for decades, that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. It was delivered as absolute truth, stamped with religious authority, wrapped in shame, and handed to us like it was gospel. But when you look at the historical record, that claim doesn't appear anywhere in early Christian writings. Not in scripture, not in the earliest commentaries, nowhere. The idea that Mary Magdalene was a sex worker came hundreds of years later, during a time when the early church was consolidating power and deciding whose teachings were socially acceptable and whose were inconvenient. There is no evidence in the Gospels that she was a prostitute. This story only emerged in 591 AD, when Pope Gregory I conflated or combined her with other women mentioned in the Gospels, creating the myth of a sinful woman to diminish her influence. I want you to listen very closely to this next part. In 1945, hidden in clay jars and caves along the Nile River, a remarkable set of texts was uncovered. Ancient Gospels that had been buried for over 1,500 years. These were books that had been banned in the 4th century, removed from what became the official Bible. They didn't fit. Why? They didn't fit the political vision that Emperor Constantine wanted to establish as he consolidated power over a growing empire. And here's the critical point. These texts were written before some of the canonical Gospels that are in our Bibles today. For Christianity, the canonical Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the 4 books included in the New Testament. Books that are not included in the official Bible are often called apocryphal or non-canonical. These might have been written around the same time, sometimes even earlier, but they were excluded for reasons such as doctrinal disagreements, but mainly for political control and power. These, quote, recently discovered books provide an account of Jesus that is dramatically different from the version most of us grew up hearing. He wasn't primarily a preacher of sin and punishment. He was a social justice fighter, a radical advocate for the oppressed, someone who challenged religious and political authorities, and who believed deeply in the innate ability of all people, men and women alike, to connect directly to God. In reality, this new information says that Mary Magdalene was one of Jesus's closest disciples, According to some of these recently discovered texts, the male disciples asked her to explain Jesus' teachings to them. Imagine that. Women at that time were considered property, yet here is Mary, a respected teacher in her own right, guiding those who had been seen as leaders. She held a position of authority and insight that was unprecedented for her time. In the Gospel of Philip, one of the books discovered in 1945, it refers to Mary Magdalene as Jesus' companion, a term sometimes interpreted as a close spiritual partnership. Other passages explicitly say Jesus loved her more than all of the disciples. Her gospel, yes, she had one, was discovered in 3 places along the Nile River. It spoke about her inner authority, spiritual maturity, and the divine wisdom that lives within each person. It elevated the idea of personal connection to God rather than obedience to a hierarchy. And according to these surviving texts, some of the male disciples asked her to explain Jesus' teaching because she understood them more clearly. This reference appears in the Gospel of Mary, specifically in section 10, where Levi defends her and says Jesus valued her insight and taught her privately when others weren't ready. And here's the thing, and please hear me on this. Most churches today refuse to even acknowledge these texts. Why? Because they fundamentally change the story. They suggest that ordinary people, men and women alike, had direct access to God. They didn't need a priest, a church, or an intermediary. And that truth, it's powerful. If the vast majority of people knew that they didn't need a church, priest, pastor, etc. to commune with the divine, then what use is the church? The Catholic Church alone has 1.3 billion members, and an estimated net worth of between 73 and $350 billion, with some higher speculations in the trillions. And that's just the Catholics. Let's get back to Mary, because the money part angers me and the new revelations of Jesus' relationship to Mary inspires me. What happens when a woman has too much spiritual influence in a male-dominated hierarchy? They call her a prostitute. They discredited her writings, and they erased her from the front lines of the movement she was clearly a part of. Does that sound familiar in any way? Because it sure does to me. Now, if hearing that makes you uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is an invitation. It's a doorway. It means something sacred in you is waking up and saying, wait, what else have I been taught that wasn't actually true? Sit with that for a moment. Have the courage to dig deep and ask questions, just like the stories about Mary Magdalene. Just like so many other cultural truths we hold today. Just like the emotional fragility we're seeing now. Fragility that comes from never having been encouraged to question, stretch, or challenge our own conditioning. We inherit beliefs in the way we inherit eye color. We repeat them, we defend them, and we don't stop to ask who created the story or what power they had to gain by telling it. Unlike eye color, we have the power to change those beliefs. This is why self-inquiry matters. This is why resisting comfort culture matters. Because when you finally step outside the noise and ask, is this actually true, or is it just familiar? Your entire life starts to unfold differently. Let's go back to our analogy about blood leaching. People trusted that treatment because it was the accepted truth, until new knowledge proved it was false. In the same way, these lost gospels offer us new information. They challenge long-held beliefs. They show us a Jesus who empowered people directly, who encouraged them to think, question, and connect with God personally, rather than through a priest, a church, or a rigid hierarchy. The suppression of Mary Magdalene's teachings and the banning of these gospels was a form of spiritual leeching, draining people of knowledge, limiting their access to truth, and keeping power concentrated in a few hands. So why does this matter to us now? Because it invites us to reconsider our faith, not to discard it, but to deepen it. What if the essence of Jesus' message was about equality, justice, and empowerment? What if the divine is accessible to each of us directly, without intermediaries? What if Mary Magdalene and other disciples weren't exceptions, but examples of what was possible for anyone willing to trust their own understanding and intuition? The discovery of these gospels doesn't diminish Jesus, it magnifies him. It shows a man willing to challenge social norms, elevate women, and inspire ordinary people to see the divine in themselves and each other. That is a revolutionary message, one that has been deliberately muted for centuries, one that has been silenced for generations. Can you imagine how heartbreaking this must be for Jesus? To be misunderstood, reshaped, and repackaged by the very institutions that built their power, wealth, and authority on his name? For thousands of years, his message of radical love, equality, and inner divine connection has been filtered, edited, and in some cases, deliberately burned or buried. A handful of scholars, monks, and church leaders throughout history knew a fuller picture of who he was. But the masses were handed a version that served political agendas, not spiritual liberation. And if Jesus truly came to free people, to empower them, to remind them that God lives within them, imagine how painful it must be to see that message twisted into fear, hierarchy, and control. It's not just upsetting, it's tragic, and it's time we talk about it. For me personally, learning about these hidden gospels written earlier than some of the canonical texts and by a woman who was close with Jesus opened my eyes to who he really was. He was not this docile preacher wanting us to sacrifice our personal power and happiness on his behalf. He was disruptive and inclusive. He was poetic and vigilant. He was passionate about authenticity and personal divinity. He held women as equals at a time when they were traded as property and had no rights. He did not seek wealth in the material world. He fought to free people from their limiting beliefs and cultural norms. He loathed the establishment, and especially those who were in religious authority. He did not peddle his talks for profit. He didn't need a church. It was the church who needed him. In John it says, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." This verse has often been interpreted by churches as meaning that access to God must go through Jesus. and by extension, through the church, its priests, or sacraments. That's the traditional reading that has dominated much of Christianity for centuries. In writings like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary, Jesus is depicted as telling his followers that the kingdom of God is already inside them, that they don't need intermediaries to connect to the divine. For example, in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "The kingdom of God is inside you and all around you, not in the buildings of wood and stone. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." This message is radical. Spiritual authority isn't centralized in church hierarchy. It resides in each person, in their awareness, intuition, and personal connection to the divine. Now, why do you think someone who is building an empire would leave this out of the official Bible? If we have access to God on our own, then there's no need for an authority, a church, or any other controlling mechanism. And why, when this new information was discovered in 1945, did the church not recognize it? The reasons are the same today as they were before, during, and still 2,000 years after Jesus walked the earth. Money, power, and control. If you take this to heart, it challenges the foundations of faith as it has been presented for centuries. That's the point. New information allows us to grow, to question, and ultimately to connect with the divine in a more personal and authentic way. And isn't that exactly what Jesus would have wanted? As this episode releases during the Christmas season, I want to gently remind you what this time was always meant to symbolize. Not perfection, not obedience, not fear, but incarnation, the divine choosing to dwell within humanity. The divine choosing to dwell within humanity. Christmas is not about worshiping a distant God on a throne. It's about remembering that love was born into the world, into flesh, into ordinary people. If nothing else, I hope this conversation invites you to sit quietly with your own inner knowing, to ask questions without shame, and to trust that curiosity is not a threat to faith. It is often the doorway to deeper truth. So, wherever you are this season, whether surrounded by joy, grief, doubt, or quiet reflection, may you remember that you are not broken, you are not unworthy, and you are not separate from the divine. You never needed permission to belong. That was the good news all along. May we have the courage to let buried stories rise, especially the ones that set us free. Thank you for listening, and Merry Christmas, friends.